NATO defense ministers, meanwhile, are meeting for a second day in Brussels, as well as more military aid for Ukraine. The focus is on Vladimir Putin's vague threats to use nuclear weapons. Here's a look at Russia's nuclear arsenal.
The war in Ukraine has once again raised a specter many had hoped humanity cast out years ago: nuclear war. Russia currently has more nuclear weapons than any other nuclear power. The exact number is a closely guarded secret, but intelligence services peg the number at around 6,000 warheads. The vast majority are so-called strategic nuclear weapons. Normally deployed on intercontinental ballistic missiles, strategic nuclear weapons have the capability to destroy entire cities in one strike. They're part of a nuclear deterrence strategy. Military planners argue governments would be reluctant to attack a country if they knew they possessed these doomsday weapons. Given their raw destructive power and Ukraine's shared border with Russia, experts argue Moscow is unlikely to deploy a strategic nuclear weapon. However, there is another option, so-called tactical nuclear weapons. They can be fired from traditional weapon systems like cruise missiles. While they are between 10 and 100 times less powerful than their strategic cousins, they still pack enough power to wipe out hardened targets without producing widespread radioactive fallout. Russia's Iskander missile system has already found use throughout the current conflict and can easily fire tactical nuclear weapons, of which Russia is thought to possess some 2,000.
I spoke earlier with Roland Freudenstein, the vice president of the security think tank GlobeSec. We talked about NATO's meeting, NATO holding a planning group meeting there, a nuclear planning group meeting. I asked him how concerned NATO is about the possibility of Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
And this is really the crucial point here. It's not the question whether Putin is serious or not. The question is, how do we react to his vague nuclear threats? And I think the idea that we need to deter him is a very good one.
Now, Germany's defense minister, Christine Lambrecht, says that NATO should adapt accordingly to Russia's nuclear threats. Any idea what she means by that?
I do not know exactly. I know there are other politicians from her party, like Rolf Mützenich, the chief whip in the Bundestag of the SPD, who has already indicated that we should be more ready to negotiate with Russia. Now, I think as a reaction to nuclear threats, that's really the wrong course. I mean, that is signaling to Putin that he is getting somewhere with his threats. If she, the minister, had in mind that we should adapt our tactics and talk to each other to coordinate how to react to nuclear threats and the possible use of nuclear weapons, she has my full support, and I think then she is right.
Russia is due to hold its nuclear exercises soon, possibly at the same time that NATO is doing exactly that. Is there a risk in this situation, Roland, that the other side's intentions will be misread? Is there a risk of miscalculation here?
That risk is extremely low because during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union have established channels of communication which still exist between the militaries and also between the political leaderships. So there is the so-called hotline between Washington and Moscow, and I do not see a significant risk of unintentional escalation here.
Now, Germany and 14 other countries have agreed on plans for a better European air defense system. What can you tell us about that, Roland?
Well, the sad fact is that basically for the last 20 years, since 2002, NATO armed forces have concentrated on a different kind of threat, more from transnational terrorist organizations, and those organizations do not possess jet planes. So air defense was neglected, painfully neglected, during most of that time. After 2014, with Crimea and Donbass and the increasing Russian threats of a return to militarized imperialism, I think there has been, to a certain degree, a turnaround in NATO policy, but that still has to take shape. So at the moment, NATO air defenses are underdeveloped, and we have to shape up pretty quickly.
Okay, so they're making up for that deficit. NATO countries, Roland, have been giving a lot of their military hardware to Ukraine. Could this be making the alliance itself more vulnerable?
No. Every tank given to Ukraine improves our security. Also, a Leopard 2 tank from Germany is worth many times more on the battlefield in Ukraine than in some kind of military depot in a German garrison. So, actually providing weapons to Ukraine increases our security because it means that the Russian military threat to us will also diminish.
Roland, thank you very much for talking with us. That was Roland Freudenstein, Vice President of the think tank GlobeSec. Well, NATO has issued a sharp warning to Russia not to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said any use of nuclear arms would fundamentally change the nature of the war.
Russia's nuclear rhetoric is dangerous, reckless, and they know that if they use nuclear weapon against Ukraine, it will have severe consequences, and they also know that a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought.
And standing by in Brussels for us is our correspondent Terry Schultz. Terry, you were following that entire news conference. It went on for more than 20 minutes. What are your main takeaways from what the Secretary General said?
Certainly today, a lot of the focus was on this question of nuclear rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin. Everyone is worried about the unpredictability of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And so while NATO says that it has not seen any practical change in the posture of Russia's nuclear arsenal, nobody can take that for granted. And so this is why they're going ahead with this long-planned exercise next week, and why the deterrence messages continue to be issued from NATO headquarters here. Nobody wants President Putin to think he's going to be able to get away with this. Now, they say that they would not respond in a nuclear way, but certainly Russia would be made to feel the consequences in a most severe manner if he were to use any kind of nuclear weapon against Ukraine.
The NATO defense ministers, of course, covering a lot of ground there over the past couple of days. We are hearing also that that several NATO members want to create a joint anti-missile shield for Europe. Tell us more about that.
Yes, this is a German-led initiative, and it's been picking up steam since budgets are under pressure and since so much equipment is being sent to Ukraine. And today, on the sidelines of the defense ministers' meetings, 14 allies and Finland, which is most likely soon to be an ally, signed an agreement that they would start working together on missile defense, on air defense more broadly. And that means that they wouldn't each just be buying national systems. They would jointly procure them. They would make sure that all of this equipment works together, and this is a big deal. This is something NATO has wanted to see for many, many years, and now it seems that the pressure from the war on Ukraine, the pressure on resources, is finally making countries work together. This is going to be a big improvement in air defense, but also simply in cost efficiency for purchases.
Now, NATO carries out nuclear exercises, readiness exercises every year, and they're going to go ahead with theirs this year, despite the war in Ukraine. Terry, is there a risk that Russia could see that as a provocation?
Russia tends to describe everything NATO does as a provocation, so I don't think that's going to deter anyone in NATO from carrying out these exercises. In fact, everyone that I've spoken with says that if we were to even think about canceling this exercise, that would send the message that bullying works, that this nuclear saber-rattling works, and it would, in fact, even empower the Kremlin to think about using nuclear weapons, because they would see that Western allies are backing down. So I'm told that there was never any consideration about calling off the exercise this year.
Terry, thank you very much. Our correspondent Terry Schultz there in Brussels.